evening and welcome to our Fourscore speaker series with Dr. Ted Widmer. Tonight's conversation will include continuing discussion of his book, Lincoln on the Verge, including his experiences when writing the book, as well as his recent involvement in the miniseries Abraham Lincoln, along with producer Doris Kearns Goodwin. My name is Angela Sterin, and I'm the Senior Director of Advancement at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. As many of you may have heard in yesterday's press release, the Lincoln Presidential Foundation, formerly known as the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation, is taking on a new role, leading and supporting efforts across the nation and perhaps the world to share the story of Lincoln's life, legacy, and leadership. As part of the relaunch, the foundation has changed its name and adopted a new brand, which will allow us to achieve its new broader mission. We hope that you will continue in your support of this new mission as we move forward with our commitment to the unfinished work of our time. For more information, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. We've been honored during this series to host some amazing authors, and I know you're going to enjoy tonight's program. As always, we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below, and we'll get to as many as possible. And now, please help me in welcoming our foundation's president and CEO, Erin Carlson-Ness.
Thank you, Angela. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our second episode of the Fourscore Speaker Series for 2022. On behalf of the foundation, I'm delighted to welcome back Ted Widmer for an in-depth discussion on his most recent book, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. I understand that following a wide-ranging conversation with Dr. Widmer in 2020, the feedback was clear. You enjoyed the discussion and wanted more time to hear and ask about his latest book. We're delighted to bring Dr. Widmer back to talk specifically about what the publisher called the dramatic story of America's greatest president discovering his own strength to save the republic. As a divided nation plunges into the deepest crisis in its history, Abraham Lincoln boards a train for Washington and his inauguration, an inauguration Southerners had vowed to prevent. Lincoln on the Verge charts these pivotal 13 days of travel as Lincoln discovers his power, speaks directly to the public, and sees his country up close. Dr. Widmer is a historian, writer, librarian, musician, and speechwriter. Professor Widmer, with his PhD in history of American civilization from Harvard University. At Harvard, he was also an editor at the Harvard Lampoon, and he was appointed lecturer on history and literature from 1993 until 1997. From 97 to 2001, he worked in the White House as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton, foreign policy speechwriter, and senior advisor for special projects, which involved advising on history and scholarship-related issues. He later conducted extensive interviews with Clinton while the former president was writing his autobiography. Dr. Widmer was also the first director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience from 2001 to 2006, and an associate professor of history at Washington College from 2001. While Ted was there, he created the George Washington Book Prize, an annual award given to the best book on the Founding Fathers. In 2006, he was appointed director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, where he led efforts to digitize the library's holdings and raise funds to save Haitian libraries in the wake of the 2010 earthquake. From 2012 to 2013, he was a senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And between 2010 and 2015, he helped to create and often contributed to the New York Times Disunion, a digital history of the Civil War, which was such an incredible resource during the Civil War sesquicentennial. In October 2016, Widmer was appointed director of the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. He is currently developing a new Humanities Lab at CUNY's Macaulay Honors College.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's wonderful to be back. I really enjoyed my last time with you all. And I can't wait to get out there in person. We're almost out of the pandemic. I hope. I'm knocking on wood. Zoom is pretty useful still, but I'd love to get out there in person.
Yeah, it'll be nice to be able to resume to doing in-person programming events and see each other face to face.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking about Lincoln seeing a lot of people face to face tonight. But first, to kick things off, Ted, tell us about what inspired you to write this book when you wrote it.
Well, this book was incredibly meaningful to me. I now realize, now that I'm done with it, that it was a very personal book. And it began, I think, with something happened in my childhood, a very simple thing, but my dad took me on an overnight sleeper train to Washington when I was about 9 years old. He had something to do there, I don't know what, but being a good dad, he walked around with me all day. And I remember we actually walked up the Washington Monument, which is not, I'm sure I could not do it now, but he did it with me. And I saw the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol and the White House. Back then you could go into everything. And it just filled me with a sense that our history is right there, that we can visit these sacred sites, and that the railroad brings us there. We literally walked out of Union Station, walked into the Capitol. And I think that was maybe where this book began. But then, as you mentioned, the Disunion series with the Times, and that was part of the sesquicentennial. And a group of young historians, I might call myself youngish and not young, but we were just trying to find new ways to write about what has been written about so much. And we were, there was maybe a dozen of us, and we're trying to pick up new stories. It was funny, we were like journalists, but about what happened 150 years ago. And in late January of 2011, maybe, I looked ahead and I saw, all right, Lincoln is going to go on this 13-day train trip in February. I mean, he'd done it 150 years earlier, but I was thinking about the future. And I thought, I'd like to cover that train trip. And I asked for permission and I got it. And I started doing a lot of research on each leg of the train journey, what people thought about him wherever he went. If I could find what he thought about them, that was even better. And it suddenly turned into a kind of adventure that was very different from the Lincoln books I had read, most of which he's sort of stationary. He's like in the White House making decisions. And, we all think of him in the photographs, and he's very still in the photographs. And I mean, they're great. But here was Lincoln on the move, and it was just so exciting. And that was enough for me to think that this was great, and maybe it's a book. I wrote a book proposal, it was accepted, and then I thought I would do it in 2 or 3 years. It took me 9. So I did not write with railroad speed, but I still love this book even a few years after being done, because it just got me out of the library. It got Lincoln out of either his home or the White House. It put all of us in a new situation, and that was exciting.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Ted. So a little bit of my background that ties into one of the reasons I enjoyed this book so much is that my minor was in ancient Greek, the language.
No kidding.
So Ted,
Wow.
the fact that you not only, you had me hooked from the first epigraph that you used from the Odyssey, but then the fact that throughout this book, you weave in Homeric phrases like the rose red dawn, or the rosy fingers of dawn. It just, to me, it was so evocative in a way that I really appreciated, because you were painting this whole story really as an epic. And so I felt like that was very effective, that you were layering in different journeys and forces that were pushing and pulling at the subjects in this story of Lincoln, this true history, in a way, sort of like a bard. I really appreciated that. Can you talk a little bit about layering in those journeys, the Homeric journey, the metaphorical journey that Lincoln was on as a politician, the physical journey, but also the philosophical journey that the country was on at the time?
Well, that is such a good question, Erin. Thank you. I love that your minor was that. I did not even minor in classics. I'm so amateur that I was embarrassed to do that, but it kept coming back. And one thing that was good for me with this book, I was youngish, but now I'm, maybe oldish. I was more comfortable doing what I wanted to do and not trying to please everybody, which when you're a young academic coming up, you're just trying to please everybody. And I had a grandfather who loved Homer. He would assign me to read the Odyssey, and it was torture. But it just got into my system. It really is beautiful. And as I was reading, I mean, for many years about this train trip, almost 2,000 miles long, which in a way is to save the country. It's not just to become the president, it's to save America, this train trip. It just kept reminding me, it was something like in the left brain, it wasn't in the right brain, that reminded me of Homer's Odyssey and that very strange story, strange but beautiful, in which a hero of Greece, but he's sort of a hero of the old Greece, and they've won a war, and then he's got to get back to his home and sort of figure out what the country is like in this new era beginning. And there are a lot of threats and dangers and challenges, and many of them are the gods are angry at him, or sometimes the gods help him. And that's what it felt like to me. It felt like our country was so up in the air, and epic forces were in battle against each other, some of which opposed Lincoln and some of which favored Lincoln. And he's just a lonely guy trying to make it from one city to the next while these huge emotions all around the country are surging. And every day he's got little challenges and big challenges. And it just felt kind of like Odysseus, just trying to get home. I mean, and a difference is he's leaving his home. He's leaving Springfield to go to Washington. So that's not the same as the Odyssey. But I think he was trying to bring our country home. I think he had a feeling that America had sort of forgotten the country that it was supposed to be. And I do have that feeling in Homer's Odyssey too, that there is a kind of a Greece that isn't that great that's coming into view. It's like all the suitors who are in his house, eating all his food and drinking all his wine and trying to marry his wife. It's a kind of hungry Greece. And that was true in America too. There was something going on that we had forgotten, our better angels, Lincoln's phrase. And so if he can come back, it's kind of like the end of the Odyssey, where the suitors are dispersed. And Lincoln, when he gets to Washington, it's a bad day for the lobbyists, and it's a bad day for the slave power, because he's going to bring it back to where it's supposed to be.
Your book also includes this idea of shifting perspectives and perceptions, and how important first impressions can be, but also how Lincoln is able to shift those over time with people that he meets. Can you talk a little bit about the impressions people had of Lincoln through the campaign itself, and what impact that had on his election and reception?
Well, during the campaign, he stays at home almost every day. There's one partial speech. It's not really even a real speech. He goes to a kind of a county fair, I think, in Springfield in August of 1860. And he's forced out of his comfort zone by enthusiastic supporters. And he basically says, I don't want to give a speech. And that's technically included in his speeches. And that's the only speech he gives in the campaign, because it was mostly understood you just stayed at home. Although one important footnote from 1860 is Stephen Douglas, one of his three rivals, actually really campaigned. He broke the taboo. He got out there and gave a lot of speeches. He was desperate, and he concocted a kind of a fiction that he was going up to New England to visit his mother, and just gave a lot of speeches on the way to see her. But during the campaign, Lincoln was relatively unknown. He was a dark horse candidate. It was very fortunate for him that the convention was held in Chicago. Got to have a lot of Illinoisans screaming at the top of their lungs, which helped his cause. So he gets it. And all anybody has are his speeches from Lincoln Douglas debates or Cooper Union or Peoria, here and there, house divided, but no one really sees him. I mean, they have, if you get Harper's Weekly, you can get an engraving of a photograph. That's okay. You can't see a real photograph. So most Americans have never seen this extraordinary looking man who's about to become the most famous American in our history. So for all of those reasons, I thought the train ride was incredibly important. And it's almost like he's campaigning, even though he has already won. He's got to go out and meet America for the first time. And he met hundreds of thousands, if not well over 1 million people during the 13 days. And each stop was very important, but overall it was even more important. And I think for, the vast majority of Americans who ever saw Abraham Lincoln in person, it happened between February 11th and February 23rd, 1861, which is sort of amazing if you think about it, because not that many people lived in DC. It wasn't that big a city, and even fewer lived in Springfield. Everyone in Springfield got to see him, but that was a tiny percentage of the country. So most people saw him during that train trip.
What did that, share a few of those impressions from the people who were maybe seeing him for the first time. They hadn't seen him at Cooper Union or any of the other, debates in the years prior to the presidential campaign. For those that were seeing this man for the first time, and hearing him for the first time, what were their impressions, and how did that shape people's opinion as he was traveling to Washington for his inauguration, while at the same time, things are falling apart in the country?
Right. Well, there's a kind of story that you hear over and over again. And I read a lot of hometown newspapers along the train route. And I don't want to forget to say the name of this database that's incredible and free. It's called Chronicling America. And it's co-hosted by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. And it's a database of every small town newspaper and city newspaper in America in the 19th, and I think the 20th too, but I was obviously doing the 19th century. And you get the same kind of report over and over again. He's not as ugly as we thought, over and over. And he used that to good effect. He was very funny and very alert to what people were saying. And he just went out over and over again and talked about himself, talked about the crisis, didn't give too many details about what he was going to do, but acknowledged the seriousness of it. And people just responded warmly. They felt this was a real person and not a politician. Mm. Not every election works this way. A lot of elections produce the two leading politicians of each party. I mean, most elections do, but every now and then a surprising outsider gets in there. And Lincoln was that kind of a person. He really actually did not have a very distinguished political career before he won the presidency. I mean, just the 1-2-year term as a congressman 12 years earlier. So nobody knew what to expect, but when he got out there, they just liked the way he looked. He looked like a Westerner, and the height and the unusual looking face and the physical strength, which I think people could tell in a room with him or even an outdoor setting. He looked strong, and we should not forget how young he was. He was 51 when elected, and he turned 52 on the second day of the train trip, which is pretty young for a president. He gave some speeches that were clunkers along the way, but I was happy to find a few, because we don't want him to be perfect. We want to tell a real story about a real person. But he really did bond with the American people. And I thought actually his worst speeches were the ones that he had written in Springfield before the trip started. He wrote he knew that he was going to give a major speech about once a day in a state legislature. So in Indianapolis or Columbus, Ohio, or Albany or Trenton or Harrisburg, state capitals were very important to Lincoln because governors were more important than they are now. I mean, they're still important, but he was going to need the governors if he needed to call up troops. And he wrote out quite formal speeches for those. But then the trip started and he realized he had to give about 20 speeches a day, like a whistle stop train ride. Just the train would stop and you have to go out and say something. And that's where you start to see the real Lincoln is all those whistle stops. And that helped me to see not only into him, because he couldn't pretend to be reading a speech, he had to just say what he was thinking about, but also into this electricity between him and the people. John Nicolay, his secretary, later said there was a form of electricity between Lincoln and the people, and that electricity, you can't manufacture that. Some politicians have it, most don't, but he had it.
Yeah, you do a wonder, picking up on that idea of electricity. I thought that there was a nice play in your book on the idea of, electricity as conveyed through something like the telegraph, that these other forces that were invisible were literally transmitting this information at such a rapid speed, and how the energy was affecting people in the room. Can you say a few words about that, Ted?
Yeah, well, that's such a good question, Erin. That is another kind of electricity. And they weren't so far behind us in 1860 and 61. Obviously, there were differences, but they could send a thought around the country within seconds, like an email, like we can now, or a phone call. And that was changing politics. One really important moment, incredibly important, it happened on the first, as the trip was beginning in Springfield, where you all are, where I hope to come back. As the trip is beginning, he gives one of his most famous short speeches, the farewell address to Springfield. And he did it without a piece of paper in front of him. I'm not sure that means he was improvising. Knowing Lincoln, he probably thought about it the night before. He was a pretty well-organized guy, but he gave this incredibly beautiful speech, which really had no precedent in American history. Presidents only talked about serious business relating to the national government. And he's not president, he's president-elect, but he gave this incredibly personal speech. It's very beautiful, about what it has meant to him living in Springfield and how much he will miss everyone. There were a few hundred people there gathered, black and white, and how he and his wife raised their children there, and they buried a child there. And it doesn't get more personal than that. And then he said, now I'm going on a trip facing a challenge even greater than George Washington faced. And he says this sort of classic Lincoln sentence of a kind we will also get in the great speeches like Gettysburg and the second inaugural. Without God's help, I cannot succeed. With God's help, I cannot fail. And it's just a beautiful speech in every way. And there isn't really, I don't think, anything like it before that moment. Lincoln has given many speeches around Illinois, but nothing quite that personal or that beautiful. He has certainly not mentioned burying a child. And that idea about God helping him is very important, and that will come back in the second inaugural. And anyway, to get back to your question about the telegraph, that impromptu thing for Springfield is beamed around the country within seconds of him saying it. And I think it really changed the way people thought about him. It made people think this dark horse candidate who lucked into the presidency, who we know nothing about, who's sort of a mediocre guy in Illinois, is a soulful, deep thinker. and there's much more to him than we ever expected. And I think women read it and wanted him to succeed, and children, and it just was a remarkable political masterstroke that I'm not even sure he knew he was doing, but the Telegraph helped to get those beautiful words around the country.
Yeah, that speaks also to how human he was to others and how they sort of felt like they could relate to him in some way or another.
Yes.
And certainly that's an impression you get, that there's something about Lincoln that draws people to him. One of my favorite descriptions of Lincoln comes from a poet that you also cite in your book, and you reference sometimes, Walt Whitman, who I just think is a master of words. And he has this essay that starts with, "I see the president every day." And it's about his commute to and from the soldiers' home that I used to lead, and the White House every day. And he comes to a conclusion in saying, quote, "I saw the president fully as they were moving slowly, and his look, though abstracted, happened to be directed steadily in my eye. He bowed and smiled, but far below his smile, I noticed well the expression I have alluded to. None of the artists or pictures has caught the deep, though subtle and indirect expression of this man's face. There is something else there." And here's where I'd like to depart from the book a moment, Ted, and ask you about an article you very recently wrote for the Washington Post, which was titled, "A Rare Painting of Lincoln Restores the Emancipator to His Full Height." And we have a picture of this. Angela, would you please share that while we ask Ted about this? So, Ted, you encountered this painting, of all places, in a municipal building in New Jersey while you were working on this book, Lincoln and the Verge. Is that right?
It is. Yes, it is.
So what can you tell us about that first experience and what led to the restoration of this painting?
Well, thank you, Erin. So fun to talk about all of this. And, I just want to say Lincoln is fun. There is new stuff to find out. The story is not over. So I was in the final years of the book, getting pretty near the end, and I was going around New Jersey a little bit when I could go to where he had been on the train trip. I wanted to. I still have some stretches I need to hit, which I actually want to still, even though the book is over. But I heard about this painting in the town hall of Madison, New Jersey. And I went and saw it, and it was just right out in a public room. It's kind of town hall where you go to pay your taxes or your water bill. And this magnificent painting is about 9 feet tall, and Lincoln is his real height inside the painting. So for the first time, I felt like I was in the presence of Abraham Lincoln, and that was an incredible feeling, not only for his height, but there are ways in which it's realistic. The photographs we see are black and white. They're very good, but you don't get skin color, and this painting has skin color. But also there's a kind of look in his eyes, and I mean, you alluded to it a bit with the Whitman quote about his way of sort of looking at you, but also he's looking past you a little bit. And I feel like that's in this painting. And it also celebrates Lincoln as the emancipator of the slaves. And I feel like that is a very important Lincoln that we have. I mean, I think the people on this Zoom know that. I sometimes think America has forgotten that. We saw a school named after Lincoln renamed about a year ago in San Francisco for the feeling that he wasn't anti-slavery enough. And it was another reason I thought this was an important painting, because it just says, here is the man who ended slavery. There's a statue to his left of a freedman, a former slave breaking his chains and standing up. The globe behind him is pointed to Haiti, where he created for the first time normal diplomatic relations in 1862. Kind of amazing that no president for 15 presidents had normal relationships with Haiti, but he was the first one to do it. and he's holding the Constitution, and right next to the Constitution is the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. So it's all there. This is the man who wanted slavery to end and ended it. And we can certainly talk about the many steps toward that end. And he was slow at the beginning of his presidency because preserving the Union was more important than ending slavery at that moment. And in fact, trying to end slavery in 1861 would probably have guaranteed that the Union would not have survived at that moment. But he ends up, as we know, what he used to be called the Great Emancipator. So for all these reasons, the painting really overwhelmed me, and I found out, I met the people who owned it. There's a foundation in Madison, and they and I became friendly. And I let it be known to the Washington Post that a very important Lincoln painting was out there. It was very nearly bought for the U.S. Capitol 100 years ago, but not quite. It was bought by a Rockefeller. But as a result of doing all this research, the Washington Post published it, and now pretty good chance the National Portrait Gallery will put it on display sometime in the next year or so. So I hope a lot of people, including Illinoisans, will get to see this painting in the flesh the way I did.
That's fantastic. And we do have folks on tonight from all across the country. So some of you, if any of you who are watching tonight are also from New Jersey, there's the chance that you've seen this yourself, and it would be great to hear from you too. That painting is so rich with symbolism, as you mentioned, Ted, and symbolism is everywhere in the book and the journey on those 13 days that Lincoln is heading to the White House. And I particularly appreciated how you opened up the context of just George Washington's birthday being in the midst of this, and how that and those patriotic observances in some ways, was creating this moment where there was hyper awareness of these patriotic observances, and that how you observed them and what you talked about was reflective of how you felt about the building crisis in this country. Can you please tell us a little bit more about that significance and those different forces as Lincoln's heading on this train to Washington, and it feels like the country is heading for a train wreck?
Well, that's a great metaphor, Erin. That's exactly right. Well, I first of all should say I felt powerfully my own patriotism as I wrote this book, and Lincoln was there bringing me toward it. He's bringing his own people of his own era toward it. He was bringing me toward it also in a different era. America is definitely heading for a train wreck in 1860, and there are competing ideas about what the country is. It's an unfortunate situation that we sometimes find ourselves in today also. We all, I think most of us, feel we love the United States of America. We do not at all agree on what that means. Does it mean more taxes to distribute more benefits to the working class? Or does it mean fewer taxes and higher protections for property? There's so many ways we could argue what does America actually stand for. And that was certainly true in 1860. And the argument had sort of focused around slavery, but it really focused on many other things too. The South, where slavery was localized in Lincoln's own word in the second inaugural, had mastered the game politically. And so it wasn't only that they were protecting slavery, they were protecting everything for themselves. And almost every president, except for the two Adamses, had been a Southerner or a Northerner who was elected by permission of the South. And when Lincoln is elected, it disrupts that system and the idea of what America stands for. And it's so up for grabs that I found evidence, I think pretty compelling evidence, that the South and pro-Southern militias very nearly took over Washington and the Capitol in the winter of 60 to 61 with the idea of creating or continuing a country that they would not have called the Confederate States of America. They wanted to call it the United States of America. And Lincoln would have been the one to start a new country. It would have been pretty easy for them to do. Just a few hundred men here or there come in and take over the Capitol, and they wanted to call it the USA, and they would continue to govern from Washington, a Southern version of the United States. It's kind of incredible to think about, but I found a lot of evidence suggesting that.
Yeah.
And a Southerner prevented it from happening. Winfield Scott from Virginia showed up and said, no, you don't. And he defended the Capitol with men and with cannons and made it possible for his fellow Southerner, Abraham Lincoln, to come into the White House. It's a beautiful story. But anyway, to get to Philadelphia and Independence Hall, in this climate where nobody knows quite what America is, it was wide open. And Jefferson Davis, who had a 2-week head start on Lincoln becoming president and had much more stature than Lincoln as a former senator and war hero and Secretary of War, he could have done all of these things. He could have said, in honor of George Washington, we are doing this, or in honor of Thomas Jefferson, we are doing that. And there was plenty of reason to connect George Washington or Thomas Jefferson to the Confederacy. And in fact, their relatives tended to fight for the Confederacy and not for the Union. But Lincoln had the foresight to realize this is a political opportunity. Washington's birthday is a day everyone feels patriotic. Let's see if the train can go to Philadelphia on that day, and I'll go to Independence Hall, where the Declaration and the Constitution were signed, and I'm going to talk about that on that day. And it was another masterstroke. And it was wide open for anyone in the Confederacy or any pro-Southern senator in Washington. There were plenty of them. And only Lincoln thought of it. So it's just an early sign that a political genius is coming to Washington. He's the opposite of the rube everyone thought he was. He's a political genius.
That's wonderful. So he's up in Philadelphia, and then Baltimore and Washington are very much Southern cities at that time. And I couldn't help but see that we have a question about the founding of the Secret Service related to the train ride. And so tying that into Baltimore and Washington, what was the mood on the train as Lincoln drew near? What was the mood in Washington? And how did that rising tension create alarm and the spreading of rumors? And can you talk a little bit about those things? That's a lot, I know, that I just asked, but yeah, they're all interconnected.
There was surface happiness on the train. They were having fun. Mary Todd Lincoln had a lot of fun. Robert had maybe too much fun. He was going out drinking most nights, and who can blame him? He was like 18 years old, and I think he just finished his freshman year of college, and he just was having the time of his life, often with John Nicolay and John Hay. But there was a sense of danger always, and one sign that Lincoln knew very well how much danger was that he had a few Army officers with him, and they had written to him as private citizens before the train trip, warning him of the great danger that lay ahead, particularly in Baltimore, but maybe also in Washington. And as soon as an Army officer wrote him and said there's grave danger, Lincoln invited that person to be on the train with him. So he knew it was going to be dangerous. He couldn't really talk about it, but he knew. And he became aware that an extraordinary detective effort was at work as he was on the train. It started just before. And this is one of my favorite stories from the book, but a woman, Dorothea Dix from Massachusetts, mental health advocate, had been traveling through the South, where she was actually welcome because she helped every state deal with its mental health problems. And she picked up some intelligence that some Southern people, or maybe they were Southern leaning people in Washington and Baltimore, not very different, were going to try to kill Lincoln on the way in. And she went to the man who ran the train called the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore that went from Philadelphia to DC. And she told him, and he found the railroad detective Alan Pinkerton in Chicago, who Lincoln actually already knew, got him to come to Baltimore with 8 agents, and they infiltrated the plot, found out the details, as many as they could, and began to send people back to intercept Lincoln on the train. But he got pretty close to Washington before they could intercept him. They began to intercept him when he got to New York. So he only had a couple days before he got to DC. And because of that, they developed a stratagem of sending him alone with 3 people, but without any extraordinary guards, on an overnight train the last night of the journey. And that got him in by surprise through Baltimore in the middle of the night and into DC on the morning of February 23rd. So he knew how much danger he was in, and he hated to do it that way. He tried to protest, but the evidence was too overpowering. And what they did was a compromise. He actually did his final day of speeches in Harrisburg, which they didn't want him to do, and then took the all-night train the last night. But as embarrassing as it was for him to sneak in, he knew that he could not go through Baltimore in a normal, exposed way. It was just, one report said there were 1,000 people ready to kill him in the streets of Baltimore. So he had to do it this way.
So as a result of that, I mean, it's safe to say that was effective intelligence, and that, his guardians did their job there.
Yeah.
So we're going to start taking questions now. But one final one for you, Ted, before I turn over to those. Your epilogue also speaks to a journey, but it's the journey home after Lincoln's assassination is how you end it. I mean, the epilogue is much more than that. And I wanted you to speak to how much had changed in terms of mood, even. I mean, obviously, we know what changed in terms of the outcome of the war and how much was different at that time. But just between his arrival in DC in February 1861 and his departure in April 1865, the circumstances are very different. But what was the mood? What was the shift that had taken place in the country?
Well, the amount of grief was immeasurable. Basically, the country experienced a form of mourning that it never had, and maybe never has since, with the possible exception of John F. Kennedy's assassination. But very deep grieving, and a feeling that was kind of the opposite of 4 years earlier, that when Lincoln was so untested, and that they realized a very great American had lived among them and led them. And so extraordinary crowds in every city, and it's almost the same train route. And his body lies in state in often 24 hours. People are coming in 2, 3, 4 in the morning. The lines never stop. And just a terrible but cathartic outpouring of grief all the way back to Springfield and the burial. And in a way, the country never quite got over it, I think. And he still is a kind of a saint, a martyr and a saint. The country had changed profoundly in only 4 years. I mean, it wasn't that long that he was president. The war had been won. That's a huge fact. Slavery had ended. That's a huge fact. But in hundreds of other ways, the government felt closer to people's lives. That was considered a good thing then, not a bad thing. better policies about education. The Morrill Land Grant College Act had passed. The Homestead Act was giving free land out to working people. One of the most generous policies the US government has ever offered, although it must also be said, damaging to Indigenous Americans in the West. Race relations looked like they might get better. His final speech talks about possibility of Black voting, and the financial structure, everything the government did, from building buildings and bridges, infrastructure, we talk about that a lot today, to financing it. It's incredibly hard to finance a war. And actually, I want to mention to your readers a really wonderful review in today's New York Times of a new book on the financing of the Civil War, which I've never read a book on that topic. But once again, I want to get back to how fun this is and how we can keep finding new things, because a scholar whose name I believe is Roger Lowenstein, I think, has written a new book on how they paid to win the war, and they devised some new financial systems to raise money quickly. And the North was way, way better at that than the South. The South not only wanted to keep slavery, it just was sort of old and arthritic, old-fashioned in every way, and these guys in their plantations didn't know how money worked very well. And that was another way the North just won. And so when the war ends, the country has really, it's like America 2.0. America 1.0 was great, but it had some fatal flaws. And there's a shuffling of the deck and a deep look at what worked and what didn't look. And Lincoln is, we were lucky that this very ethical president was there as that was happening and put us back on a better course that kept the best of what had already been there, but made us more honest with ourselves, I think, and not that huge a leap from Lincoln to the great struggles of the 20th century, the world wars, the New Deal, the space program. It's very different, but I included a photograph of the moon on the day of his second inaugural, because I felt like these great national initiatives that he led, beginning with the winning of the war, made it possible for us to think big in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Oh, that's a fantastic segue to a question we got from Patricia, who said, can the time of Lincoln traveling in the Civil War be compared to World War I or II and surrounding economics?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I think so. So Lincoln's rhetoric that we are fighting a war for democracy, which he didn't always say, but he does say it at Gettysburg beautifully, better than anyone ever has said it. And sort of says it in the second inaugural. That rhetoric, I think, was in the back of Woodrow Wilson's mind at the beginning of World War I. He talks a lot about fighting a war to save democracy. Historians now struggle a bit with Woodrow Wilson because he had some pretty severe problems. He fired a lot of African Americans who worked for the federal government, and just, his idea of democracy was a fairly racist idea. I do think he was sincere when he talked about bringing democracy to Europe and the world, which, as we now see in Eastern Europe, is still a huge problem. And so, having said something a little negative about Wilson, I'm one of the few historians who might still say something nice about him, that I think he was trying hard to replace the anti-democratic systems of Europe before 1914 with something better, in which people could actually vote for the leaders they wanted to. And we're just still seeing how hard that is. And then FDR absolutely is putting democracy front and center in the fighting of World War II. And his speech about the four freedoms beautifully talks about, he identifies four freedoms that Lincoln never actually mention. Lincoln talks a lot about the Declaration of Independence, but not about individual human rights. And FDR says we have these 4 rights that are sacrosanct: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. I do think Lincoln was getting there, and his final paragraph of the second inaugural talks about helping the veteran and the widow of the killed veteran and the orphan. And that's sort of freedom from want is in there, I think, helping people in need. But FDR says it a little more clearly than Lincoln.
Yeah. Paul asks if you have a sense that Lincoln felt he could still find a way to avert the war, or does it seem that he felt it was on some level inevitable?
That's a great question. I think for most of my life, I felt like he was all-knowing, he was omniscient, and everything he did was perfect. And I now, with a little more, a few more years and a lot more reading, have seen some mistakes that he made, and I think that it just makes him more interesting. He gave a couple clunker speeches on the train trip. I mentioned some good ones, but there were some bad ones. And I'm not sure he really knew his military strategy when he became president on March 4th, 1861. I think he was really hoping Southern Whigs, whoever they even were, would somehow persuade the leaders of the Confederacy to come back to the bargaining table, or that they would just calm down, that time would calm things down. And if he just promised not to interfere with slavery in the South, they could maybe work together. And obviously they couldn't. And they actually played into his hands very well when they attacked at Fort Sumter. And he could say that they dealt the first blow. But I'm not sure he really knew what he was doing. And James Buchanan, who's such a bad president, tried something similar. He tried to provision Fort Sumter also with the Star of the West, and we hate him and we love Lincoln. But Lincoln in the early weeks, I'm not sure he knew what to do a whole lot more than James Buchanan. I could well be corrected by someone on the Zoom, but that I have a little more of a feeling that he was just sort of winging it in those first few weeks.
Yeah. You referenced, maybe the South's claim to George Washington, and Roseanne said that she thought she actually understood that George Washington said if a civil war to occur, that he would actually side with the North. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. It's a very interesting
Yeah.
quote. That's fascinating.
Well, and I'm paraphrasing it. I don't know that Roseanne was relaying it as a quote, but
it doesn't surprise me. I mean, what is so interesting about George Washington is he works equally well on either side, and both sides love him. He's obviously a Virginian, and as I said, his family members largely fought for the Confederacy, but he's a Unionist. I mean, he's the great Unionist of his era. He basically creates the country, first with his military leadership, and then with his political leadership. And he rises above politics. He's almost godlike and embodies the Union. And as parties begin to form, he's very unhappy about it. But the side he sides with is the Federalist side and Alexander Hamilton, and much more Northerners than Southerners, although there are Southern Federalists, but it's the people who like the Constitution, not the crazy anti-government people. So I think there's a lot of evidence that he would have been with Lincoln.
That's great. So there have been a few comments about this too. So I want to be clear that we have every intention of continuing these Zoom webinars. We are excited to be able to add in-person events again at some point here in the near future. But several of you have mentioned that, and trust me, we love the fact that we've been able to reach so many of our members nationwide, and that it's a convenient way for us to bring something to all of you and enjoy this time together, and then also add these to our growing archive of programs on the Foundation's YouTube channel. I think we have time for only one more question, unfortunately, Ted. So you're going to have to come back a third time, or I
Well,
might.
I'm so happy to do it, Erin. I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And I love my fellow Lincoln people. And I would love to come in person to Springfield, but also I'm going to a conference at Purdue in Indiana on June 10th and 11th and 12th of this summer. So maybe I can meet some of you there. So
I feel like we need to do a train trip
would
across
be
the
great.
country
Yeah.
where we can talk about your book and we can stop in all these different cities throughout. That would
love
be
it.
wonderful. So I'm going to combine two questions. One, there wasn't a name attached, but it goes really well with one that we were asked earlier from Cinda, who wanted to hear about your research journey. And we only have a couple minutes here, but she wants to know sort of where, what, how you keep organized. And then it's not the same, but related. Someone asked if there's a particular place where you feel Lincoln's presence.
Oh, wow. There's such good questions. Well,
So one's very concrete and practical, and one, I just really appreciated that question. I would love to hear your response.
I'm an old-fashioned guy, and I read a ton. I love the work Douglas Wilson does at Knox College in Illinois. Incredible. I actually read a lot of Lincoln's speeches and all of his forms of writings in that. It's like a multi-volume set from the early 1950s by Roy Basler.
Yes,
It's online for free. The
Yeah.
University of Michigan has it online for free. So maybe, Erin, later you could let people know. But I just wanted to read his words, and that's as good as it gets. I mentioned the newspaper website, Chronicling America. I went to the Library of Congress, which was great. They have a lot of his papers. I had a day at the Lincoln Presidential Library that was unbelievable, but I'm ashamed to say it was only one day because I was traveling around and I couldn't stay. But again, I would love to come back. And then places where I feel him. Well, before the Zoom started, Erin and I were talking about the Lincoln Cottage in Washington, which I cannot recommend strongly enough. It's just such a powerful experience. And Lincoln felt ghosts himself, and you feel his ghosts when you go there. It's a little effort to get out of the touristy zone of Washington, D.C. to get over there. It's totally worth it. It's just an incredible place. So I love that place. I thought Lincoln's home in Springfield was incredible. I still would really like to go to where he grew up in Indiana, in southern Indiana. I might try to do that when I go to Purdue in June. And also, I wrote a little bit about, there's a place where a creek, the Anderson Creek, meets the Ohio River near a small town called Troy, Indiana, where he started to operate a flatboat. And I'd like to go there sometime. I think Lincoln might be present there also, but certainly the home and the main square, just the square and the old State House and where his law office was, all of it, he's there. He's definitely there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted. We really enjoyed this tonight. Thank you all for so many of your great questions. I saw that we had the Katie Hall Educational Foundation in Gary, Indiana, joining us tonight. So Indiana is representing very well, in addition to people from across the country and in Illinois. So thank you again so much, Ted. We really appreciated this. We have so many links to share with folks following up on tonight's program too. Just really wonderful stuff. Thank you. Angela?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Ted, for tonight's discussion of Lincoln on the Verge. I hope everyone picks up a copy if they haven't already. I know our members enjoy the opportunity to hear more about your book and a little bit about, Doris Kearns Goodwin with the miniseries. We're excited that you worked on that. It's wonderful. If you haven't registered for our upcoming webinar, then please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and sign up soon. Next up, for our Fourscore series, it will feature Dr. Carolyn Janey on Tuesday, April 12th, for discussion of her recent book, Ends of War, The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox. And we hope you'll join us. When you close out of the webinar tonight, you'll see a short survey. Please take a few moments to complete the survey, as it helps improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you'd like to see in the future. We're grateful for every member and donor and sincerely appreciate your ongoing and generous support of our foundation. Until next time, we thank you and wish you a good night. Thanks, everyone.